"I'll be back. Dad's waiting at the lake," Jason said, already closing the car door as Emily's hands tightened around the seatbelt and the pain rolled through her again, sharp and undeniable, the kind that told her this was not a drill, not nerves, not imagination, but the real beginning of labor. And yet the parking lot was quiet, the hospital entrance just a few dozen yards away, and the morning air smelled faintly of gasoline and wet pavement as Jason walked off with his phone to his ear, promising he wouldn't be long, promising everything would be fine, promising nothing at all. And Emily watched him go without screaming, without begging, because something inside her had gone still in a way she didn't recognize, the dashboard clock ticking louder than it ever had, each second measuring not just time but priority, choice, and absence. And as another wave came, she pressed her palm against the steering wheel, breathing the way the nurse had taught her in the prenatal class. Jason skipped because his father had needed help with a trailer that day, and she noticed the small things her mind clung to when it refused to panic, the crack in the windshield they kept forgetting to fix, the coffee cup in the holder with his name written wrong, the fishing hat he'd left on the back seat like proof of where he'd chosen to be. And she remembered how many times during the pregnancy Jason had said his dad wouldn't always be around, how family traditions mattered, how fishing was the one thing that kept them close, and how Emily had nodded, adjusted, waited, telling herself there would be time later for her needs, that once the baby came everything would settle into place. But now the minutes stretched, 5, 10, 15, and no text came, no footsteps returned, only the dull hum of cars passing and the automatic doors opening for other families who arrived together. And Emily felt a calm determination replace the fear as she unlocked her phone and called for help herself, giving clear answers, stating her location, her due date, her symptoms, her voice steady enough to surprise even her. And when the call ended, she rested her head back and stared at the pale sky, realizing she was doing this alone because she had always been doing more alone than she admitted. And as assistance arrived and the car door finally opened, it wasn't Jason's face she saw but a stranger's professional calm. And she thought of the baby who would soon be here, depending entirely on the choices made before it could speak, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that this moment would not be explained away later with jokes or apologies, that it would live inside her as a line she would never step back over. And while Jason cast his line into quiet water miles away, convinced there would be time to smooth things over, Emily crossed into the hospital without him, carrying not anger but resolve, already making a quiet promise to herself that the child entering the world today would never have to wonder whether they came second to someone else's hobby, someone else's comfort, or someone else's nostalgia. And that promise, formed in silence and pain and absolute clarity, was the beginning of a next move no one waiting at the lake would see coming. Emily woke to the low beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of footsteps outside the room, the light filtering through the blinds telling her it was already late morning, and for a moment she lay still, absorbing the unfamiliar quiet that followed the long night, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones alongside something steadier and heavier, a new awareness that her life had shifted while she was focused on breathing through pain, and listening to instructions from people who had shown up when it mattered. And when she turned her head and saw the bassinet beside the bed, she felt that grounding certainty return, the one that had taken hold in the car, because the baby was here and safe and real, and Jason was not yet, not when the nurses had asked who to call, not when the paperwork had been placed in her hands, not when she had been wheeled down bright hallways thinking about how many moments in the past year had followed the same pattern of waiting and adjusting. And she remembered how Jason had promised to be different once the baby arrived. How he had laughed nervously and said he just needed to keep his father happy for a little while longer. How fishing trips and family favors had always come with an expiration date that never quite expired. And as she lay there now, she noticed how easy it was to breathe without the pressure of expectation. How no one was asking her to be patient or understanding or flexible. And when Jason finally walked in, hair damp from a rushed shower and clothes changed too quickly to hide the lingering smell of lake water, his smile was tentative, rehearsed, the kind that expected relief on the other side, and he started talking immediately, filling the space with explanations about how his father had needed him, how the timing had gotten out of hand, how he had assumed labor would take longer, and Emily listened without interrupting, watching his hands move as if shaping excuses he had used before, noticing how his eyes flicked to the baby only after he finished speaking, as if checking off a responsibility, and when he reached for the bassinet she did not stop him but she did not help either, her silence forcing him to slow down, to look at her face for cues that were no longer there. And the nurse returned then with forms and gentle questions, asking Emily directly who should be listed for certain decisions, who would be contacted first, who should receive information if needed, and Emily answered clearly, her voice calm, her choices intentional, while Jason stood beside the bed realizing too late that these were moments he could not rewind, and later, when he stepped out to take a call from his father complaining about the fish not biting the way they used to, Emily watched him through the glass and thought about how many times she had put her own needs on hold because it seemed easier than confronting the imbalance, how she had convinced herself that loyalty to family meant silence, and she understood now that silence had only trained others to expect her to wait, and as the afternoon passed she held her child and paid attention to the details she would remember later, the steady rise and fall of a tiny chest, the warmth of skin against her arm, the sense that this responsibility was clear in a way her marriage had not been. And when Jason returned and asked what she wanted to do next, where she wanted to go after discharge, how soon she wanted visitors, Emily met his eyes and answered with simplicity rather than softness, saying she needed time and space and certainty, words that landed harder because they were not raised in anger, and Jason nodded, unsettled by the absence of reassurance, not yet understanding that the woman in the hospital bed was no longer measuring her worth by how well she waited for him to choose her. And as evening settled and the room dimmed, Emily felt tired but unafraid, aware that the quiet decisions she had begun making were already reshaping the future, not through confrontation or drama but through clarity. And while Jason sat scrolling on his phone, sending updates to people who had not been there, Emily focused on the steady presence beside her, knowing that the shift had already happened and that what came next would follow from the resolve formed in the hours when she had stopped waiting to be prioritized and started acting as if she already was. The day Emily was cleared to leave the hospital arrived quietly, without celebration or visitors crowding the room, and as she dressed slowly and gathered the few belongings they had brought she felt an unexpected sense of control, as if each small action reinforced the shift that had begun before the baby was born, and Jason hovered nearby asking practical questions about car seats and timing, trying to sound involved while avoiding the deeper conversation he sensed was waiting. And when they finally stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Emily paused, adjusting the blanket around the baby and taking in the ordinary sounds of traffic and distant sirens, aware that life outside the hospital had continued uninterrupted while hers had been redrawn. And during the drive home Jason talked about taking time off work, about how his father wanted to stop by later in the week, about how everything would feel normal once they were back in their own space. But Emily listened without responding, watching familiar streets pass by and thinking about how often normal had meant compromise on her part, how often she had accepted half attention because full attention seemed like too much to ask. And when they reached the house she went inside first, moving carefully through rooms that now felt different, noticing how little space had been made for her needs compared to the careful organization of Jason's hobbies and inherited belongings. And over the next few days the pattern repeated itself in subtle ways, Jason offering help when it was convenient, stepping away to take calls from his father, assuming Emily would manage because she always had, and Emily did manage, but not in the way he expected, because instead of waiting for him to notice the imbalance she began to adjust her life around the reality she had finally accepted, keeping a written record of appointments, expenses and conversations, not out of spite but clarity, understanding that memory could be reshaped by excuses while notes could not. And when Robert called to announce his visit and joked about how Jason had needed a break before the baby arrived, Emily listened from across the room as Jason laughed along, and she saw with painful clarity how the story had already been rewritten to minimize what had happened. And later that evening when the house was quiet and the baby slept, Emily opened her laptop and reviewed documents she had postponed looking at before, insurance information, parental leave policies, savings accounts, and legal forms she had assumed would never matter. And as she read she felt the same calm determination she had felt in the car, realizing that preparedness was not an act of hostility but responsibility, especially now. And the next morning when Jason suggested his father might come fishing again soon and asked if Emily would mind, she met his question with a level gaze and asked instead who would be home with the baby, and who would be available if something unexpected happened, and Jason hesitated, surprised by the shift in her tone, offering vague reassurances that failed to answer directly, and Emily nodded, absorbing the answer he had not given. And in the days that followed she set boundaries without raising her voice, declining visits that disrupted her recovery, insisting on schedules that prioritized the baby's needs, and making decisions without seeking permission. And each time Jason seemed unsettled, Not angry but confused, as if the familiar dynamic had changed. Without warning, and one afternoon when he asked whether she was upset about the day he left the hospital parking lot, Emily did not accuse or recount details. She simply said that moment had shown her exactly where she stood, and that clarity had not faded with time. And Jason looked at her then with a mix of regret and disbelief, beginning to understand that apologies could not undo the impact of absence. And as Emily held her child and felt the steady weight against her chest, she knew that whatever came next would be shaped by the decisions she continued to make, not by arguments or ultimatums but by consistency. And while Jason struggled to catch up to the version of her that no longer waited to be chosen, Emily moved forward with quiet resolve, aware that the foundation she was building now would determine whether her child grew up watching a mother who adjusted endlessly or one who stood firm when it mattered most. By the second week at home, the rhythm of the house had settled into something predictable, and predictability gave Emily room to think, to notice patterns that had once been blurred by exhaustion and hope, and she observed how Jason announced plans rather than discussed them, how his phone lit up with his father's name and he stepped away instinctively, and how decisions about time and money drifted toward habits formed long before Emily had entered his life. And instead of reacting, she began to prepare, arranging pediatric appointments during hours she could manage alone, confirming backup transportation, and quietly meeting with a family services advisor recommended by the hospital to understand her options should she ever need them. And the act of gathering information felt steadying rather than confrontational, like building a foundation brick by brick. And when Robert arrived for his visit, he filled the living room with stories and opinions, praising Jason for being a devoted son and joking about how new mothers worried too much. And Emily listened with polite distance, holding her child and noting how easily concern was dismissed when it complicated someone else's comfort. And later, when Robert suggested another fishing trip to celebrate becoming a grandfather, Jason laughed and agreed before looking to Emily for confirmation, and she met his glance without the reflexive nod she once offered, asking instead how long the trip would be, and who would be available at home. And the room grew briefly quiet as the question landed, not aggressive but unavoidable, and Robert waved it off with a comment about how women always managed, and Emily felt the clarity she had come to trust sharpen further, understanding that nothing would change if it remained unchallenged. And that evening after Robert left, Emily asked Jason to sit with her at the kitchen table. Not to argue but to outline expectations, speaking slowly and precisely about shared responsibilities, about availability, about what it meant to show up consistently. And Jason listened with visible discomfort, promising to do better, promising adjustments, promising effort, and Emily acknowledged his words without letting them replace action, knowing promises were easy when they cost nothing. And over the following days she followed through on her own plans, setting aside funds in an account in her name, updating emergency contacts, and scheduling a consultation to understand custody considerations, not because she intended to leave but because preparedness was a form of care. And when Jason discovered the appointment on the calendar, he asked if she was planning something behind his back, and Emily answered calmly that she was planning for the child's future, and that transparency did not require permission. And Jason fell quiet, unsettled by the shift in balance. And one afternoon, when he returned early from work expecting praise, Emily thanked him and asked if he would be available the next morning for a checkup. And when he hesitated, she did not argue, she simply noted the answer and adjusted accordingly. And this pattern repeated, small moments revealing priorities more clearly than any confession. And Emily responded by aligning her life with what was reliable rather than what was promised. And as weeks passed, Jason began to notice the consequences, how decisions were being made without him when he was unavailable, how his presence mattered only when it was consistent, and the realization unsettled him because it removed the assumption that Emily would wait. And one evening he asked if things could go back to the way they were. And Emily looked at him with honesty and said she did not want the way things were. She wanted better, and better required changes that words alone could not accomplish. And as she held her child and felt the quiet confidence that had replaced fear, Emily understood that her next steps would not be dramatic or loud. They would be deliberate, rooted in the knowledge that stability was created through action, and that whatever direction her life took from here would be shaped by the standards she had finally set and refused to lower, even when doing so made others uncomfortable. As the first month passed, Emily noticed how consequences, not conversations, began to reshape the household, and Jason felt it before he named it, the way routines shifted around his availability rather than waiting for it, the way decisions proceeded with or without his input depending on whether he showed up. And he reacted at first by trying harder invisible ways, cooking dinner one night, rearranging his schedule the next, gestures that suggested effort without consistency, and Emily acknowledged them without celebrating, because she had learned that praise too early encouraged patterns that faded. And one afternoon when Jason announced that his father had planned a weekend trip and expected him to come, Emily listened quietly while feeding the baby and asked a simple question about coverage for the next pediatric visit, and the follow-up call with the insurance provider. And when Jason hesitated, she answered her own question by confirming alternate arrangements she had already secured, and the ease with which she did so unsettled him more than an argument would have, because it revealed a future where his absence no longer stalled progress, and Robert sensed the shift as well during his next visit, commenting on how organized Emily seemed and how independent new mothers became these days, and Emily accepted the remark with a neutral smile, understanding that independence often emerged from necessity rather than preference. And that night Jason asked whether she trusted him anymore, and Emily considered the question carefully before answering that trust was built through reliability. And reliability was demonstrated through repeated choices, not intentions, and Jason nodded without replying, absorbing the implication that the standard had changed. And days later when he forgot a scheduled commitment and arrived home late with another explanation centered on his father, Emily did not react with anger. She simply followed through on the plan she had made, completing the appointment alone and updating the records accordingly. And when Jason asked what happened, she told him calmly that the appointment had been handled and the notes were in the shared folder if he wanted to review them, and the normalcy of her tone left no opening for debate. And over time Jason began to recognize how many privileges he had taken for granted, assuming access, assuming forgiveness, assuming that Emily would always adjust, and the realization came slowly, accompanied by an unfamiliar sense of instability, because the leverage he once held through expectation had dissolved, and Emily continued forward, finalizing documents, clarifying financial responsibilities, and building a support network that did not rely on last-minute availability. And one evening when Jason returned early and found Emily reviewing paperwork, he asked directly whether she was preparing for separation, and Emily answered honestly that she was preparing for stability, and that stability required clarity regardless of the outcome. And Jason sat down then, the weight of the moment settling in, as he realized that the woman across from him was no longer negotiating for attention but defining terms, and in the weeks that followed he attempted to align his actions with his promises, canceling plans, setting boundaries with his father, and being present in ways that were new to him, and Emily observed without rushing to reward the change, understanding that time would reveal whether it endured, and through it all she maintained the steady rhythm she had established, centered on the child and the life she was building. And as nights grew quieter and routines solidified, Emily felt a sense of quiet authority take hold, not rooted in control over others but in alignment with her own values. And she understood that whatever direction their marriage ultimately took would be determined not by a single dramatic decision but by the accumulation of choices, and that her role now was not to persuade or chase but to continue moving forward with consistency, allowing actions to speak where words once filled the space. And in that steady progression she felt grounded, aware that the balance of the relationship had already shifted, and that the next phase would unfold according to the standards she had set and the resolve she maintained. By the time the baby was 6 weeks old, the atmosphere in the house had changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable, and Emily felt it most clearly in the quiet moments when no one was performing or promising anything, when actions either happened or they did not, and Jason seemed caught between old habits and new expectations, trying to balance loyalty to his father with the responsibilities he could no longer postpone. And Emily watched this struggle without intervening, understanding that growth could not be forced, only observed. And one morning when Jason left early to help Robert with a minor repair and promised to be back before noon, Emily noted the promise without comment and went on with her day, taking the baby to a scheduled checkup and handling the paperwork herself. And when Jason returned late with an apology and an explanation that sounded familiar, Emily listened and nodded and said she had already managed everything. And the absence of reproach unsettled him more than anger ever had, because it removed the opportunity to defend himself. And later that week Emily finalized several administrative updates she had been reviewing, ensuring that medical and emergency records reflected the reality of who was consistently present. And when Jason noticed the changes he asked whether she was shutting him out, and Emily replied that she was documenting what was already happening. not creating something new, and the precision of her words lingered with him. And as days passed, Jason attempted to demonstrate commitment by canceling plans and staying home more often, but Emily measured the change over time rather than moments, understanding that consistency was the only proof that mattered, and Robert reacted poorly to these shifts, calling Jason to complain about missed trips and accusing Emily of being controlling. And when Jason relayed these complaints, Emily responded calmly that boundaries were not punishments and that prioritizing one's household was not abandonment. And Jason grew quiet, confronted with the reality that pleasing everyone was no longer possible. And one evening after the baby was asleep, Jason admitted that he felt caught in the middle, and Emily acknowledged his feeling without softening her stance, explaining that she had spent years in that position herself and had learned that being in the middle often meant being overlooked. And Jason absorbed this slowly, beginning to see the pattern not as a single conflict but as a history. And in the following weeks, Emily continued to act with steady intention, setting routines that supported recovery and stability, planning finances with caution rather than optimism, and leaning on people who showed up without being asked. And Jason noticed that trust was no longer requested but earned, and that opportunities to rebuild it appeared through daily reliability rather than grand gestures. And one afternoon when Robert arrived unannounced expecting Jason to drop everything, Emily remained seated and asked politely whether the visit had been planned, and when Robert bristled at the question, Jason surprised both of them by explaining that now was not a good time. And the tension that followed was brief but revealing, and after Robert left, Jason stood in the doorway uncertain, aware that something fundamental had shifted, and Emily met his gaze and said nothing, allowing the action to stand on its own. And as the weeks continued, Jason made more choices that aligned with his family rather than his past routines, and Emily acknowledged these choices quietly, noting them without exaggeration, and through this process she felt her own confidence solidify, rooted not in control over Jason's decisions but in her ability to respond effectively regardless of them. And she understood that her next move was not about confrontation or departure but about maintaining the standards she had set, knowing that whether the relationship endured or evolved, she would not return to a version of herself that waited to be prioritized. And as she held her child and watched Jason move through the house with new awareness, Emily felt neither triumph nor resentment, only clarity, recognizing that the future would be shaped not by a single defining moment but by the steady accumulation of choices made when no one was watching. And she was prepared to meet whatever came next with the same calm resolve that had carried her this far. As the third month unfolded, Emily noticed that stability brought its own kind of clarity, stripping away excuses and revealing intentions with uncomfortable precision. And Jason felt it too as the margin for error narrowed and every choice carried visible weight. And one evening when a letter arrived confirming updates Emily had submitted weeks earlier, Jason read it twice, recognizing the implications he had once assumed were automatic. And he asked carefully when she had taken care of it, and Emily replied that she had handled it when it became clear consistency mattered more than assumption. And the conversation that followed was quieter than he expected, lacking accusations or raised voices, and that quiet forced him to sit with the reality that time did not pause for reconsideration. And in the days that followed, Jason began to experience the consequences of being late or unavailable in ways he had not before, missing the opportunity to be present for moments that proceeded without him. And while Emily did not restrict access or create barriers, she did not rearrange plans to accommodate last-minute changes. And this neutrality was unsettling because it left Jason solely responsible for his outcomes, and Robert's influence grew louder in response, calling more frequently and framing Emily's boundaries as disrespect, urging Jason to reassert himself. And Jason listened but hesitated, sensing that choosing that path would undo the fragile progress he had made. And one afternoon when Robert arrived unexpectedly again, Jason met him outside and asked him to schedule visits going forward. And the brief exchange was tense but restrained, and afterward Jason stood in the kitchen uncertain, waiting for Emily's reaction, and Emily acknowledged the effort with a nod and returned to what she was doing, understanding that change required reinforcement through time rather than praise. And as weeks passed, Jason's attempts to align with the household became more consistent, and Emily observed the shift without relinquishing the structure she had built, recognizing that trust was cumulative and could not be restored through intensity alone. And one night when Jason admitted he feared losing his place in his own family, Emily responded with honesty, explaining that place was not something she could assign or protect for him, that it was maintained through presence and reliability. And Jason listened without interrupting, absorbing the idea that belonging was not guaranteed by title but by action. And the following weekend Jason declined a long-planned outing with his father to stay home, and while the choice was not dramatic it was telling, and Emily registered it quietly, understanding that patterns were changing, and at the same time she continued her preparations, completing consultations and ensuring contingencies were in place, not as a threat but as a safeguard. And when Jason discovered these preparations he asked whether they meant she was preparing to leave, and Emily replied that she was preparing to stay only under conditions that were sustainable, and that answer lingered between them, and as the season shifted and routines solidified, Emily felt grounded in a way she had not before, no longer reacting to disappointment but operating from a clear set of expectations, and Jason began to realize that the version of Emily he was trying to regain did not exist anymore, replaced by someone who measured stability through actions rather than promises. And this realization brought a mix of grief and respect. And one evening when the baby slept and the house was still, Jason apologized without qualifiers, acknowledging not just the absence that began everything but the pattern that followed, and Emily listened and thanked him for the honesty without rushing to reassure, knowing that reconciliation, like trust, required time. And as they sat together in the quiet, Emily felt neither vindicated nor bitter, only resolved, aware that the power in the relationship had shifted not through confrontation but through consistency, and that whatever the future held would be shaped by the standards she maintained and the choices Jason continued to make when no one else was watching. As the months continued to pass, Emily found that the clarity she had built now demanded consistency not only from Jason but from herself, and she held to the standards she had set even when moments arose that tempted her to soften them prematurely, and Jason sensed this restraint as both challenge and opportunity, understanding that progress would be measured quietly rather than announced. And one evening after a long day he suggested they talk through future plans, speaking carefully as if choosing words might restore what had been lost, and Emily listened without interruption, allowing him to outline intentions about shared schedules, family boundaries, and long-term stability. And when he finished she thanked him and said she would need time to observe rather than respond, because plans mattered only when reinforced by repeated action. And Jason accepted this without protest, recognizing that persuasion was no longer effective. And over the following weeks his efforts became less performative and more routine, showing up without announcing it, handling responsibilities without reminders, and declining obligations that conflicted with the household without making it a statement. And Emily noted these changes with the same neutrality she had applied to earlier failures, neither discouraging nor celebrating prematurely. And Robert responded by withdrawing slightly, offering pointed comments about how families used to function, and Jason listened with less urgency, having learned that defending every criticism only reopened old dynamics, and Emily observed this shift from a distance, aware that realignment often provoked resistance before acceptance. And one afternoon when Jason was late due to an unavoidable delay he called ahead with details and alternatives, and Emily adjusted plans accordingly, registering the difference between absence and accountability, and that distinction mattered, because it acknowledged shared responsibility rather than assumption. And as routine stabilized, Emily revisited the safeguards she had put in place, reviewing them not with anxiety but with confidence, knowing they existed to support rather than threaten the life she was building. And when Jason noticed her reviewing the documents he did not ask defensively, instead asking what they meant for their future, and Emily answered that they meant security regardless of outcome, and that security allowed her to engage in the relationship without fear. And Jason nodded, understanding that this foundation was necessary if trust were to be rebuilt. And one quiet evening as they sat together without distraction, Jason admitted that he had underestimated the impact of his choices, believing that intentions outweighed outcomes, and Emily responded that outcomes shaped reality regardless of intent, and that realization had freed her from waiting for understanding before acting. And the honesty of the exchange marked a shift, not toward resolution but toward mutual awareness. And in the weeks that followed, Emily allowed herself to acknowledge progress without relinquishing boundaries, permitting closeness to develop naturally rather than through obligation. And Jason responded by continuing to align his actions with his words, learning that presence was not a favor but a requirement. And as seasons changed and the household settled into a sustainable rhythm, Emily felt a calm confidence take root, aware that she no longer feared being left to manage alone because she had already proven she could, and that knowledge changed the balance of the relationship permanently, not through threat or leverage but through self-assurance. And while the future remained open, Emily felt prepared to meet it without hesitation, knowing that the standards she had established would guide her choices and protect the stability she had worked to build, and that whatever direction the relationship ultimately took it would do so on terms defined by reliability, respect, and the quiet strength she had discovered when she stopped waiting to be chosen. By the time a full year had passed since the day everything changed, Emily no longer marked time by what had gone wrong but by what had steadily been put in place, and that shift was evident in the way the household functioned with calm predictability rather than tension, and Jason sensed it as well, aware that the relationship now rested on firmer ground precisely because it was no longer propped up by assumption. And one morning as they prepared for a routine appointment, Jason moved through the tasks without instruction, checking details, confirming timing, and anticipating needs in a way that once would have felt unfamiliar, and Emily observed this not with surprise but with quiet acknowledgement, understanding that reliability revealed itself through repetition rather than declaration, and Robert's presence in their lives had settled into a more distant rhythm, contact that respected schedules rather than disrupted them, and while occasional friction remained, Jason no longer rushed to appease it, having learned that stability at home required boundaries beyond explanation. And Emily appreciated this not as a favor but as a correction long overdue, and as routines continued, Emily reviewed the preparations she had made months earlier and found that many of them were now simply safeguards rather than necessities, and this realization brought a sense of quiet satisfaction, because the strength they represented no longer felt reactive but integrated. And one evening as they sat together after the baby was asleep, Jason reflected aloud on how close he had come to losing what mattered most without realizing it. And Emily listened, without softening the truth, acknowledging that absence did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it accumulated quietly until it reshaped everything, and Jason accepted this without defensiveness, recognizing that the consequences he had faced were proportional rather than punitive. And over time Emily allowed herself to engage more fully, not because fear had vanished but because confidence had replaced it, and she understood that vulnerability was safest when supported by self-trust. And as seasons changed and milestones passed, Emily noticed how her own posture in the relationship had transformed, no longer leaning forward in anticipation or backward in compromise but standing firmly in place, and Jason responded to this stability by meeting it with steadiness rather than negotiation, and the dynamic that emerged was not perfect but it was honest, and that honesty felt sustainable. And one afternoon while walking with the baby, Emily passed the hospital parking lot where the pivotal moment had begun, and she felt no surge of bitterness or regret, only recognition of how far she had come from that stillness in the car, and she realized that the most significant change had not been in Jason's behavior alone but in her own understanding of what she required to feel secure, and that understanding had reshaped every decision that followed. And as life continued, Emily carried forward the lesson that clarity, once established, did not need to be defended repeatedly, it needed only to be honored consistently, and Jason, now fully aware of what was at stake, continued to align his actions accordingly, understanding that partnership was not maintained through apology but through presence. And as their child grew, Emily felt confident that the environment being built was one of reliability rather than uncertainty, and that knowledge anchored her more deeply than reassurance ever had. And while the future remained open, Emily faced it without apprehension, secure in the knowledge that she had learned to act decisively when it mattered and to trust herself when circumstances demanded resolve, and that quiet certainty, forged in a moment of solitude and carried forward through deliberate choice, would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead, ensuring that she would never again mistake patience for partnership or silence for stability.